Welcome to the Crash Chords podcast. I don't know why I did on that kind of like an up note. It was kind of weird.
Yeah, it's still unenthusiastic.
Yeah.
It was a little sarcastic almost.
Yes.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
What was that?
Gosh. I think he was attempting
It was
to
that
do
old.
Gosh.
Was that old character from like a? What was it? That cartoon from the 50s?
That narrows it down to
Yeah,
a lot of things.
You know the one.
That
Goofy?
one? No, it's not Goofy. Goofy has a little more.
Wow,
Wow, that was really good.
And it's
That was
That was
bad.
particularly
a
good.
Decent soundbite. Now, who are those two
I'm
dogs?
joking.
Who are those two dogs? You remember the two dogs?
two dogs.
There were two dogs. Remember the two dogs?
No. I remember two stupid dogs.
Someone is going to
From the
remember
90s.
this.
Two dogs?
Who's listening? Someone will.
Who
No.
did this?
Prickly Pete? Was that it?
I don't
Prickly.
Prickly Pete, I think, is Disney.
Poopity Pete?
I think you're thinking of Pete from Mickey Mouse.
That's a different thing. No.
I know. That's what I'm saying. It's
know.
the
Anyway,
wrong
getting
thing.
back on
Wrong
track.
thing.
So, good news, everyone. We're finally going to have Painless Parker on the podcast in September. We set a date today, so look forward to that coming up. Also, this week, I'm getting to see a Broadway musical for the first time in a while. Zachary Levi, who I got to meet back in July.
And I'm really jealous of because you didn't even watch all of his stuff, and I'm freaking in love with the guy.
I'm in love with him.
Just
for
shy
a
of in
different
love with
reason.
him. He's so good. He's such a great...
Oh, wait till you meet him.
He's so
Oh, wait,
good.
I don't think I've seen him in anything.
That's a shame. He's
He's best
actually
known-
very talented.
He's best known for
But anyway,
Chuck.
and for Tangled, he was the voice and singing.
He was
voice
Ryder
of
from
the-
Tangled.
Yeah, the male lead. Flynn Rider. Anyway,
Sure.
To put it this way,
Thanks,
fans were able to do what they could never do with Firefly, which is keep Chuck from going under because they love this guy so much.
well, fans didn't get a chance to do it with Firefly. It was gone before we realized it.
Yeah, because it was Fox.
Anyway, so I'm sitting,
Like, everybody needs to get off their Firefly love. It was 13 episodes, like how many years ago now?
And I never showed him in order, but that's all
Yeah.
besides the point. Anyway, back on track.
so the musical is called First Dates. It's him and Krista Rodriguez starring, and I've heard good things. I've heard good and bad things. The Times bashed it, but they bash everything these days.
Yeah, we were just talking about how bad they are at picking out books.
So
Yeah, but who looks to the Times for reviews?
not me.
I look at the Times to see what they bash, so I read it.
But I'm looking forward to seeing the musical. It should be a lot of fun. So I'll have more on it next week after I've seen it.
We're really
Oh, I'm
attacking
also
media.
seeing Shakespeare in the Park this week. And that's also a musical. I don't remember which one, though.
Which
Shakespeare in the Park. Well,
is not musicals.
that's
'cause
that's a
Shakespeare-
thing in the park.
Yeah, no, they're musicals.
Yeah, but it's not really Shakespeare
No, it is.
Shakespeare is not musical.
at all. He never wrote a musical.
It's
He wasn't a musician.
It's Shakespeare in the Park, and there's a musical. I don't know what it...
Maybe there's two different things.
There's a way to
Shakespeare in the Park is something that everyone should take advantage of at some point. In Central Park, they do free Shakespeare concerts, and it's awesome to get your free experience.
It's one of the few places you can routinely see one of my favorite plays, which is the play that should not be named.
Whether
Might as well name it.
Macbeth.
Oh,
Why'd you name it?
Well, because we're not on stage.
that's true.
But either way, if it's not a
Might as
musical,
well be.
whatever. I'm seeing Shakespeare in the Park on Thursday, so that should be fun.
Third base.
Awesome. Is there any transition to the thing that we're doing today? Because
No,
I see none.
we're just
not
going right
really.
into it.
No.
Okay,
Nope,
this is a
got
new
nothing.
genre, as I described last
Well, the
week. We're
genre
going
is not
into-
new. It's
No,
new
this
for
is-
us.
The genre's pretty old. Yeah,
Yeah, it's been around a
about
while.
100.
It's one of the first true
Plus years.
modern genres, so it's, really old.
Modern in as much as it was formed in the 20th century, based on things from the 19th century. But yes, it's pretty modern as they come. Not as modern as rock, but it gave birth to rock.
It gave birth to a lot of things.
Anyone guess what we're talking about yet? I think I said the name. Jazz.
Yes. Our first jazz record on the podcast.
Yes.
And
Well,
actually-
let's face it, jazz was the most popular music in America for 40 years, between the 20s and the 50s, and then it was replaced by rock and roll. So jazz has never stopped being popular, but it stopped being the most popular media in America. So everyone kind of looks to rock these days for the news, hit, the new single.
I don't even know if I go that far
That's true.
anymore. Pop is
Rock,
probably-
actually, it's been said that rock has been on its way out for a while now. They've enjoyed their 40 years, and now we're in a weird mesh of pop, hip-hop, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that's become kind of a world genre because it's spread everywhere. Everyone does hip-hop to some extent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But getting back to jazz itself, this is not your Kenny G jazz, all right?
This isn't
Thankfully.
isn't even a group of upstarts who are trying to form their own jazz band.
And
I started you strong. This is a virtuoso, a very well-known virtuoso by the name of Chick Corea.
And I must compliment you on this because this guy's been around for
Ever.
long enough that he has seen almost every type of jazz in its creation.
That's why I chose him. He came around in the generation that followed the 50s generation of jazz, which was one of the strongest. Even though that's when jazz went out as a pop form, it's interesting that that's when jazz became the language of the intellectual elites, so to speak, and all the youth music became rock and roll. But John Coltrane was doing really advanced technical stuff. It was almost the equivalent of classical for the 20th century, considering that no one was really following contemporary classical musicians. So there was a whole generation of people there who everyone should know. If you have a good knowledge of music, you should probably know the names of John Coltrane, Dizzy Gillespie, even before that, Louis Armstrong, and there's a whole generation that followed in the 70s, and Chick Corea is one of them.
Also, if you want to laugh, go to the Wikipedia page and look up his discography.
It's in the range of 50, 60 albums.
It's
Not,
ridiculous.
to be fair, it's not all original work, because he's in such high demand. He's as skilled as they get on the piano these days. He worked with a lot of other musicians, so it's a lot of, Chick Corea featured with this, featured with that, and live
did a lot of
compilations as
live
well,
records.
and playing the standards of existing jazz music. That's a very big, rich tradition. It's replaying.
He's prolific in use the same way Paul McCartney has been over his career. A lot of people have approached him. A lot of people have asked him to sit in on sessions. He does have a very large core section of just his work.
True. And yet, he hasn't done anything for the last 10 years or so. This is his first original work. And I actually saw an interview where he wanted to get back into the thick of it. He wanted to get back to writing original compositions, or at least a framework of original compositions, and working with a new band that was full of younger musicians, which is the backing band, which we believe is Chick Corea and The Vigil. Incidentally, the album also called The Vigil.
Yeah. Now, we run into a couple of issues here because, to be honest, the Wikipedia page is underappreciated, and even Chick's homepage is very hard to find information on this actual album. Yeah. That's how new it is.
Yeah, it's this stuff from the 70s that really everybody knows about. Most recently, it's the people who follow him regularly are the people who are going to know his career. So, incidentally, let's see what he's doing as a 72-year-old man.
Yeah, and impressive for a 17-year-old man. So, moving into the first track, called Galaxy 32, Star 4.
Which is unusual.
And a very specific sound. It's like coordinates on a spaceship.
It's as if to say, and this is the jazz sense of humor, there's no shortage of jazz tracks who have this kind of sense of humor. It's a very flashy way of saying space.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, I'll pin you down to that one.
I almost want to expand upon that and say, this is where we're coming from. That, I think, is what they're trying to say in their title, because I feel like the track itself is a great way of saying, this is where we're coming from.
There's even an earlier point to say that, the album cover itself. Once again, every once in a while we like to mention this. We don't like to make judgments based on the album cover, but there's a connection here. It's a very silly cover of a horseman riding through a nebula.
A knight.
A knight, yes, a knight riding through a nebula.
Lance
also, a lot of the
everything.
track names on the album have a space or space theme. Most of them do, actually.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think it was very apparent to me the opening foray into this theme right here. It was apparent that it was a space theme. Like I heard it at least. Maybe not everyone would make that connection, but there were reasons why I heard it. It was a very open sound. You didn't hear any dissonance in the beginning. In fact, it was the opposite. It was very open. You were getting what they call an anhemitonic scale, which means no semitones. You don't get that note right next to each other as you do. Instead, it was an open pentatonic scale, which is a very classic thing for Chick Corea. He's used a lot of pentatonic scales in his life, and only has 5 tones as opposed to your classic 7 tones. Every other, almost everything we've heard so far in these reviews has been about 7 tones. That's your classic major, minor, and everything else.
Right.
Pentatonic, it's looser. And because of the type of pentatonic scale he was using, it was called the suspended pentatonic scale or Egyptian pentatonic scale. It's so open. You have no hint to major or minor. That's, in my opinion, why it sounds so spacey. So that's a reason. It's one reason. You know, you might get anything else, perhaps of the instrumentation itself.
Just to try to get it into layman's terms, I think I understand a little bit better. The spacing, the frequencies of the sounds are further apart from each other.
Exactly.
So it actually creates distance within the sounds themselves.
It's the opposite of dissonance in many cases.
Okay.
Aaron Copland used to do that all the time to achieve, like, nature, open land. So he would use, like, super wide intervals.
I think I should do my own Webster's dictionary.
The layman's dictionary?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to provide it for these guys.
Yeah,
Probably.
yeah. Maybe,
I
yeah.
mean, as far as intro tracks go, I thought it was a very strong intro. I really liked the spacey kind of feel you got from it. Although my biggest problem
Just
with...
to say, this is just the intro we're talking about right now.
Right, and also this track, I mean, so the majority of the tracks on here were 8 minutes or more. So there was only one semi-short song. The rest of them were these huge pieces.
Yeah, short song for this album is 5 minutes.
So, but with this track, my biggest problem with it, when we get towards, like, the middle of it, it loses the space vibe.
Well, that is true. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But I will say that it seemed to have more direction after the intro. Like, the immediate solo after the intro, I very much enjoyed. Because it starts to move away from that open sound. You get a little bit of a foreshadow where it actually does go into a semi. We get a minor scale, and we throw that in. So all of a sudden, it changes its tone. It doesn't pull it away from spaciness necessarily, but it pulls it toward, I guess, something that's a little bit more understandable, a little bit more relatable, because it sounds so otherworldly in the beginning, and yet it moves into something that's almost...
familiar?
Yeah, familiar, kind of even sensual, so to speak. And that's where the first keyboard solo, I think, really derives its power.
I'm going to make a claim. I'm not 100% sure it's true, but it's more... It was an upbeat, high, easy flow. It's more like opening credits. And I say this because it's uses an exposition-style introduction work for each of the various artists being used on the track. You get a lot of different punctuated solos built around a framework, an impressive framework, with the bass and the drums.
Right, and it's a very free-spirited framework, I think. And that, again, goes back to that open nature of the introduction.
So it's almost like opening credits. You're getting introduced to the various roles you will be seeing in this album.
Exactly.
And I think it does a great job of doing that.
And the first...
Specifically, and I have to point this out right away, the late guitar work and even the late clarinet work was just so good.
It was really great.
Yeah. But I do want to go back to something that Matt said here, because he said he felt like it departed from that spaciness. And I want to... We've already established this, and we're going to reiterate it several times throughout this... Well, many times throughout this record, that this is virtuoso quality material right here. Every single person in this is a profound talent, and we owe them a lot. Let's just get into the specifics here. Jazz itself does have a tendency to provide this short framework, and that short framework is the theme. We get it very briefly, and we will return to it. And jazz, in its best execution, I believe the solos themselves should always borrow from that theme work. They should always return to that theme work, restate it in some way, and explore all the different ideas that they can offer. And this does, and yet at the same time, it doesn't. There's so much exploration going on in here that it can sometimes feel like there is a search back to the theme. And the exploration of each idea is so, I almost want to say frivolous, that it, as awesome as it is, you wonder what the first statement was. You wonder what the theme was. You actually have to be reminded later on, like, oh, that's right, this is the song. That said, these solos are amazing. I could still get lost in them, but that's the same thing. I'm getting lost in them. it could either be a positive or a negative. It's kind of tricky to gauge, and that's one of the reasons why I think jazz gets such a bad rap for the younger generation who's used to rock, which is, by comparison, so much more rigid framework. You have your verse, you have your chorus. If there is a solo, it's in a very controlled bracket. You can't ignore it. You can't forget what you just heard. It's very related. And yet jazz likes to explore. They love exploring, and the best jazz musicians can explore so far from the norm that it's hard for the average listener, for the layman, to understand. So,
well, I mean, also, I think that being someone who listens to a lot of songs, air quotes, someone who doesn't listen to a lot... The instrumental, even that I listen to, a lot of it's in a very rigid framework. I mean, let's take Pacific Rim, for example, as far as just framework. A lot of those songs, and that's why I think you guys didn't like a lot of them, where they were very standard and in a very tight framework, in that kind of rock framework.
They had one thing to say.
Yeah, they didn't have many different things to say. Whereas listening to this, and the thing that I liked about Galaxy 32 Star 4 is that, I love the name, because it's literally, like I said, to me as a sci-fi fan and a video game fan, it's like someone punching in a coordinate. Like, that's where you would be telling the pilot to take the spaceship. So I love the naming alone. But the fact that it has this kind of openness because of the way it's arranged, and then goes into this more...
Right, because the solos are dissonant.
Yeah.
And so in many ways it does contrast itself.
Yeah. And that's, I think, what threw me off at first. I don't know that it's a bad thing. I'll step back on that.
No, that's another thing. I want to, just to go back to what I was saying, it's not necessarily a critique of mine. It's just an honest representation of what jazz is. This is why people love it, and it's also why people hate it.
Yeah.
I will point out a couple of points, a little bit separate from what you said, but within the framework. And speaking of framework, this, I gotta go back to it. It sets up a real strong current for how the music is going to be created in this album, which is a combination of the bass and drums delivering not really the beat, but the cohesive glue for most of the songs.
Right.
Working with the piano or keyboard, because it switches back and forth.
Right.
That becomes the core trio.
In many ways, it's the soul of this entire album, not just this track. But it's easy to understand why, because of the nature of those three instruments. And we'll get to this in a little bit later in our topic discussion, that certain instruments just have character to them. The piano is an inherently percussive instrument, even though people think of it as melodic. And, of course, the drum's obviously percussive. And in many ways, so is the bass, because it pops. Sort of, that's just the nature of it. So when you have three working together, it's almost like hearing three percussive pieces.
And each of them it takes over a separate role. Now, when they're working purely in unison, like they did at some points in just Galaxy 32, which I'm going to not do the rest of the name, it's interesting because they are working at the same level. It's hard to point out, okay, maybe the piano is taking more of a forefront, maybe the bass is, but it's really like they're on even footing. But when you're introducing other instruments, especially the clarinet and late guitar solos, or exposés, it's...
I'm not even sure if it's a clarinet. It could be a soprano sax.
It's
tough to hear at times.
Really difficult to delineate the differences because of just the speed and the percussive nature of the background. The piano or keyboard is working with this new instrument. The drums tend to take a very high energy role to propel everything forward, while the bass takes a role to draw everything together. It's really, really intricate work.
It's really fantastical. It's a spectacle to witness.
This becomes a part of the whole album and is really shown very well in Galaxy 32.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize how much I really do love this track. At the same time, I feel like I have to explain some of the obvious issues that certain listeners might have with this kind of thing. I speak of context a lot. Almost in anything we do, I speak of context. That's how well ideas are expressed as parts of the whole. And because that theme is so brief, and we go into so many solos, I feel it's tricky sometimes for an audience to follow it, but I can, and I still feel like they reach so many climaxes throughout. It's like the climax puts those solos in perspective. So here's just some of the things that it offers. The free-spirited nature that I described, the percussion, the bass, we already said, is tight. It's fluid beyond compare. Some other ideas, it starts as like a funk line, so you can tell he's almost borrowing from kind of some of the stuff he's done in the 70s, or at least the culture that was around in the 70s. It's almost dark. It's melancholy. These are the kind of climaxes that it reaches, and I think really puts the rest of the track in perspective, at least in my opinion. So I was digging that through and through. Then you have these, like, chromatic declines, that's using that dissonance to go down, and he goes on playfully, and he rises up again. And it's those target notes that he hits sometimes where the emphasis is really, really strong. They seem to be the most dissonant. It's almost strikes me as awkward, but yet it makes perfect sense when you consider the melancholy climaxes. So these are just some of the ideas, and just considering what he does, also, he's a jazz pianist, so he's gonna show off. That's
Yeah.
just
He does.
evident.
He does.
You get these insanely fast runs throughout the entire track. I also, at the same time, I like his use of space, as in not playing, choosing to just kind of take a backseat when another instrument is playing really strong. He will comp sparingly.
He has a great understanding of punctuation.
Exactly.
Using the piano to really exemplify, that's close to the word I wanted to say, another instrument.
Emphasize.
No, exemplarize is not a bad word.
Okay.
He really knows how to say, hey, look at this guitar, using a piano.
Yeah. He sometimes
it's great work.
He breathes.
in that.
He breathes in order to listen to the ideas, while never breathing so much that it's that he's completely taking a step back. But he breathes just enough to listen to the other idea and then work off of it and come back even stronger and influence the soloist's idea. That's how much talent this guy has. It's common in jazz. At the same time, it so often fails. A lot of solos out there in jazz can be so aimless, and it's clear that this guy has a point. It can sometimes seem like he doesn't. There always is a point.
Yes, but
for a span of minutes.
We did discuss at the very beginning. There was a moment, not the very beginning. I think right after the intro in this track, where there was this guitar work before the great guitar work at the end. That was kind of fleeting. That I liked, but you weren't as fond of because it kind of came and went really quick.
It came and went, and at the same time, when he came back later on, he did expand for 3 minutes or so, and that's when I felt like it was the ultimate climax of this track.
Yeah.
I think it was actually a different guitar. It did not sound like the same guitar, to be just frank about it.
I'm not positive, but it could be. At least he was playing it a little bit differently. Was there any information that there were two guitars in this
of
band?
the band listing, and we'll get into the full band listing later, it just mentions an acoustic guitar and electric guitar, both played by the same person.
Oh, okay. Because that's what it felt like. It felt like there was... The earlier stuff sounded more acoustic than the later solo, which was definitely electric.
Right.
It's possible. I mean, it doesn't really say specifically.
Which is a little... If that is in fact true, because there's a lot... It's you can hear every note, but it's hard to truly understand every note at such a pace that they are setting, which is why we get confused with the clarinet and the saxophone.
This is why I tend to use those climaxes as a guide.
He may have switched instruments halfway through. I don't know. I would not put it past them.
Yeah, nevertheless, I firmly hold that final solo between the guitar and also the keyboard comping. It was practically a duality at that point, like fugue style, with just two instruments going at it and having fun together. It was
one hunting the other. That was the real thing. You felt war. I felt the piano was trying to hunt down that electric guitar.
It is.
Show it what to do, and then the guitar just
took off. And this is actually
again.
where Chick Corea, he introduces a little element that comes back several times over the course of this album. This little stuttering effect, where he'll just bounce on one note, and it kind of chases the other one, and it rises up chromatically, as I said, one note following another, and that's really where the guitar derived its fuel, I think, was based on that one idea from Chick Corea.
And you can see the virtuoso skill when he does that, because his stutter almost seems electronic. It's just so fast and so precise.
Yeah.
It feels electronic. Like, it doesn't even feel like it could be done.
And not just his stutter.
It also...
Naturally.
The skips in the stutter he puts in it, too, which are just properly placed. That's the only way I hate...
You and your word
You
proper.
hate that word. I
No,
cannot-
you know,
it's
I'm
proper.
going to accept it just for the hell of it here, because
That's where it should have been.
that's jazz at its best, in my opinion. The story becomes clear at that point. Like, that's my main problem. There's a lot of people that can be really, really talented, these soloists. You know, you can, yeah, right, sure, you're not hitting any wrong notes per se, but do you have a point? Are you following
Right.
anything? I feel this guy is following it. That if you are able to create a story improvisationally, you're in prime form in the
Right.
jazz field.
And the next track, Planet, what is it, Chia?
Okay.
That's this song. You're talking story. This song, just from beginning to end, is one
Without fail.
story.
And in fact, I think this is one of the strongest transitions on the album.
Oh, yeah, from
Because
the end
of
of
the way that
Galaxy.
the end of Galaxy 32 Star 4 ends. Talk about references. I've mentioned this so many times. I'm mentioning it again. Vangelis, the album Albedo 0.39. I don't know whether he was following the tradition of jazz that had been out. At least that was my first experience with this. But the spacey openness, again, even more open than the intro. The way that ended pertains... It blended perfectly with the solemn piano intro of Planet Chia.
And that was the first thing that caught my attention, was the beautiful piano intro to this song. Like, I was immediately engaged.
to dive right in is an experience, because you've built such high level of energy in Galaxy 32 that this is an instantly soothing introduction.
There was almost a primal nature to this entire track. And even to the introduction. It's interesting because the introduction almost would harken back to classical, really.
Yeah.
You'd get a lot of impressionism from this. Of course, it uses a lot of jazz chords. Really, really interesting stuff. It's mostly Phrygian, though. Phrygian, again, we recognize it as kind of a Middle Eastern scale. Middle Eastern scales, of course, what do you think when you think the Middle East? You think belly dancers, you think snake charmers, exotic stuff. And you also think maybe even that, because just a little bit of history, they made their way over to Spain. And when Islamic culture entered into Spain, it blended with them to form their own culture, and that's where we get that quintessential Spanish guitar style, which is present throughout this entire track. So, well, that's your framework you're working with here.
But to really delve into the story that's here, the starting piano, the soft solo work, is instantly calming, yet creates a sort of pressure in its style, because it becomes more frantic and yet can't release. And once again, it's the trio. When the bass and drums come in, the upright bass and drums, you feel that release. That now, here we go. The story begins to take off.
Best moments in the album, to my opinion, is when that solo piano just gave way to the bass. It was there's so much tension there, as I said. That kind of the dissonance that you get with the Phrygian scale, and then just released with that bass. Not you're still in Phrygian. It's just that bass. It's like an undertone that really well engineered. I got to give the engineer here some major prop points.
And that leads into a combination of things to come, because once the expose of this story really...
The exposition.
The exposition of this story, of this song really gets underway, you're introduced to the clarinet and the Spanish guitar, which really become prolific in this song. They really set a contradictory tone to the piano work that you were heard in the beginning. And it's this contradictory tone... oh God, it's so hard to explain. It's very moving.
Let's put it this way.
It's a hard thing for me to really get into.
We'll try our best. I will say this. Based on everything I said in Galaxy 32 Star 4, this almost contrasts it by giving us so much more theme.
Yeah.
A lot more composed material, right? Granted, there's still a lot of improvisation in this track, but I think we're settled into the story a lot earlier than we are with Galaxy. We have to search for it. We have to wait for it in Galaxy 32 because it's a space track. You're not exactly sure where to...
You gotta zoom in.
Yeah, exactly. You have to explore it because it's not... You're not used to that sound. It's something that's very new. Yet, in Planet Chia, we're almost getting stuff that's been around for many centuries. It sounds ancient, it sounds tribal, it sounds exotic, all this other stuff. So there's a familiarity, not just to the piano intro, but also to the theme work that follows. It's a very solid melody. Massive stretches, as I said, of just composed material. These rhythmic loops that are... When they come back, you have to smile. That. We all said that. We all had that experience.
That was the most memorable moment to me in this song, was that when that kind of almost fun, almost cartoony sounding rhythm comes in, it just puts a smile on your face. You can't help but laugh. Feel.
Every transition really creates an exuberant release.
I think that kind of proves the point I'm trying to make about, like, this is all ingrained in all of us. Some of these scales, they go back, like, it goes back centuries, the instrumentation, at least... Based on the clarinet, it kind of almost sounds like the instrument that used to be used in the Middle East. I forget the name of it off the top of my head.
The stereotypical
for snake charming and all that, yeah. So many visions will come to mind as a result of this, just from media.
And that whole ilk.
Exactly.
But this is obviously...
This is taking it to a whole other intellectual level.
A wee bit more
complicated. And that's why I think that the transition worked so well, because it's like a space rendition of this exotic theme. It's fantastic.
But here's my characters, and this is something that visually was so stimulating in my mind, I could not get it out of my head. The piano feels like the main protagonist of this story. The clarinet, or
soprano
sax, because we really can't figure out which is which. At times, they're so intricate, and that's the woman of this story. And the Spanish guitar is the antagonist.
Yeah, and again, going back to the story here, I feel like there's a reason why we should feel that, because I felt the same exact thing. I felt like the Spanish guitar is your hero. You know, he's marching in to, save the girl. Maybe he's being seduced.
No, the Spanish guitar I felt was the antagonist.
The antagonist? Interesting.
And the piano was the protagonist. You said the piano felt more like the...
For the sake of discourse, I felt that he was the narrator.
Yeah. And I definitely could see that, but it was so ingrained. And the big thing was when the clarinet became the forefront, the way the clarinet and the piano were going tete-a-tete with one another was just so much of a primal's not the right word, but just such a pursuit of one another.
I follow that.
Such a sensual combination. That...
I very much follow that. At the same time, I feel it was more the case of... It was tricky. We're splitting hairs here because it's all interpretation. All interpretation. You may have a completely different idea. I'm talking to the audience now. But at the same time, I still feel like the emphasis of the piano is not there as much. He does not get as much solo work here as he did back in the first track.
But that is because you're focusing on the woman at this point, because up until this point, the piano was truly the forefront. Or the piano was blended with both the clarinet and guitar.
But then why should the piece have started out with the piano solo?
Because it's explaining your hero.
The narrator is explaining your hero. Exactly.
I felt like there was a real union between the clarinet and the piano in the second third of the song that really just became an expose on their relationship. And that third...
I don't mean... Just to put a period at the end of that argument, because it could conceivably go on forever, I personally think that no matter what, I'm not disparaging the work of the piano in this piece. The comping is incredible. It puts every other soloist in perspective.
Yes.
I have to say that it's more about those soloists. The theme here revolves around those soloists. They are the climax.
Well, here's my other half of the argument. The third. Not the outro, but the third of the song.
Okay.
Is the Spanish guitar no longer in unison with the piano. Now they are competing, and it's once again that hunting nature in the two instruments. They're not directly overlapping, but they're not directly separate in their bits, in their pieces, in their composition. They are actually competing to become forefront. Now, the Spanish guitar is definitely taking a larger role, but I feel like the piano does not take the backseat it did with the clarinet.
All right, I'll give you that point.
The piano really is fighting.
If we're thinking of the same part of this track, I'll give you that. At the same time, who knows? That could be a narrator breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah.
Who knows? This is an argument that really could go on forever. It's all interpretation, and that's as far as I'm concerned, that is success for this jazz piece.
And here's
If
my
it
final thing.
incites debate.
The outro was great because that's where I found our narrator with the bass and drums, and especially the bass.
Correct.
It complements and levels out everything, especially the ending of the piano bass work was just so sweet and settling. I have to see the bass as the narrator.
Yeah. No, I could definitely see that. I also want to just to move into something a little bit different here. I wanted to get into something. I already mentioned that there's a huge Middle Eastern vibe, huge Spanish vibe. I want to just hone that a little bit further. I think some of this maybe even derived from like the Cuban music that you would get from like the 1950s, which was pretty prevalent at the time. This is sort of, I guess, when you could say the jazz pop bubble sort of seemed to reach critical mass, and like I said, all that stuff became reserved for intellectual classicists, as it were. I know I've already beaten this point into the ground. It's just, it was so prevalent here, even more so than in the first track. Planet Chia really is an exploration into the past while combining a look into the future. I think it's a good way to sum it up.
We should also, at this point in the album, since we're about a third of the way done, because it's a short, long record, Steve took a lot of classes in jazz and jazz theory, so he knows a lot about this stuff. He's got a lot of exposition to spout, but we won't try and run along or bore you with details, but Steve has a lot of information to speak on this because he went to school for it, and it's actually really fascinating
and
to get kind of a background on it.
And if, to be honest, anybody listening, if you've been intrigued with either of the first two tracks, please send Steve any question you have, because he will go at length. He had to do it for us, because, to be honest, there's a lot of things in here that, while I'm familiar with jazz the same way I'm, like, familiar with, I don't know, Niels Bohr, like, I know it exists, and I know some little aspects of it. It was hard for us to see it in a framework without a lot of work built into it.
Well, for me, with jazz, I've always observed jazz as something that people dance to, that I've danced to. I've never gone to a jazz concert, and I've never listened to a lot of jazz on my iPod either.
That's a lot better, yeah.
I mean, to put it simply, with Planet Chia, like, I felt a narration of sorts. I felt this story, but I didn't really feel a clear vision like you did. It was more, I got the emotion of happiness and almost joy from the part that made me smile.
That part comes back many, many times.
There's this sleazy kind of feel, like some of the bar feel. Like, you got this little bit of sleazy, grungy, like, bar feel. Then it went into this kind of romantic, almost courtship feel.
And that just goes back to the history again.
Yeah.
When, this stuff was played, of course, at least during its prime time, it was played in kind of those sleazy little joints. Of course, they were borrowing from that whole Afro-Cuban tradition. And it's fascinating to follow, like, the musical family tree. I could definitely go on that stuff forever.
And it's also fascinating that even though we all have distinctly different impressions in the specifics, in the general, they all mesh, and they are very similar in the general terms of what we felt and what we saw.
So I want to go into just one last thing here with Planet Chia, and then we can move on to Portals of Forever, which offers even different things. Let's put it this way. There's two ways you could view this. I am mostly on the side of John here in terms of the way this track just blends together, all the stuff that it's offering. At the same time, I just want to play devil's advocate. It almost seems to be a bit of a static emotion to me. Not in the case of individual moments, but in the case of the entire track. Like, with the exception of maybe that first piano introduction, the rest of the track, it really just goes through all these different phases of solos and combining, but we never move away from that Phrygian mode. That's almost the same front to back, except for the times in which the theme returns. But John once said this, I feel this is no better represented in this track, that it's almost like a saw blade. This is your comparison, John, that it reaches like climax, And then it goes down, we cool off, we plateau for a little bit. It reaches another climax, no higher than the previous climax. Picture a saw blade in your head, obviously there's not going to be like a ridge that goes above the other ridge. And I feel like this track was the embodiment of that, where it leaves me hanging, whether track 1 or track 2 is better or worse, it's entirely up to you, but I do feel that track 1 broke that saw blade vision to me, that it reached higher climactic points that this one just couldn't reach. It was a steady story that I almost feel was explained to me within the first 2 minutes.
But saying that it couldn't reach it, I feel like is wording it wrong.
No, not couldn't.
Just didn't want to reach. It wanted to kind of have this wavy vibe.
Right.
But also,
it's almost like its own little.
But also
epic.
based on the emotion that I that I kind of attached to this song, I feel like if it broke and had that kind of pinnacle moment, it would have ruined the story. This kind of ebb and flow was perfect for the emotion that you were pulling from it.
And I accept that. I accept that.
And that's why I do rate Planet Chia as the best song on the album. Not necessarily the best individual parts, but as a cohesive unit, I feel like it is the best.
It does seem to work the best as a whole.
Because of that...
That's my only gripe, though. I'm not sure. Between Galaxy 32, I still feel like it might be best for me.
The cohesive nature of the story, and the fact that I really saw a story, as opposed to the exposition I saw in 32, regardless of the quality of it, a story just grabs me more.
Okay.
There's something about the completeness of the idea that grabs me more.
Maybe it was just the familiarity of the tone. For me. The familiarity made this track a little bit more... It made it static. It's not that it made it worse in any way. It's just I felt that Galaxy 32 Star 4 had the freshest material. But I think I'm going to leave it on that. And disclaimer, if you think it's ridiculous for us to be arguing this early in our review whether we love track 1 or track 2 better, these are long tracks. They require this.
And also to bring up something that you brought up off air, I don't remember if you mentioned it on air, is that these tracks are highly open to interpretation. So we could talk at
Jazz
length.
itself is open to interpretation.
Right, that's what you'd said. So, we're going to go on to the next track, but we could keep talking about this track for probably another 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But we don't have 3 hours to podcast.
Yeah, not this week.
So moving on to Portals to Forever, which is track 3, which immediately from the beginning you get a more electronic sounding, kind of techy, groovy...
Because of the use of the electronic piano, the keyboard, instead of an acoustic, old-school piano. This is a very similar instrument with a completely different sound, which, from its inception, changes what we're listening to here.
It was... this is more similar to the first track than the second track. This goes back to, as you said, it's technical. Not just technical, but as you said... it feels like almost a jazz form of techno. There's definitely a technological element here.
I want to bring up something, though. Yeah. I want to bring up something, though, while I'm looking at the credit listing of who played what. It doesn't list the keyboard. It says he only plays grand piano on the entire record.
Well, that's bull.
Well, that's what it says. I don't see keyboard. It's not listed.
Is there a different keyboardist?
No. So that's curious.
That's incorrect, because it's obviously a keyboard.
3, 4, 5,
I imagine he played
6,
the keyboard too.
7. There's 7 individuals, maybe more. I can't count them all. There's
This is
7
ridiculous.
individuals.
I saw the interview of him in a studio. He's sitting in front of a keyboard.
Right there. No, that's guitar.
Yeah, that's a guitar.
I saw the word electric and got excited. Anyway, Portals to Forever. This one has
It's definitely keyboard.
Has
it's a
another
silly point of me.
This has another introduction which spends its time building to something higher. It's once again introducing a theme.
It introduces a theme, and as I said, it's spacious, it's open, it's very similar to track 1 in that regard. We're moving away from the epic that we got in Planet Chia. This is no more earthy or exotic and tribal. This is back to the future. This is back to the vision that you got on that cover of the album.
It's less individualized.
Yeah. This is exploring the grand. I mean, just think of the title of the track: "Portals to Forever." You can't get any further away from the present than that.
Yeah.
Further away from the present, this point in our time-space continuum.
Now,
And the instrumentation tends to do that too. Past that opening theme, we get this disjointedness of rhythm that just starts going all over the place. Again, it's a spectacle. It's not. For some people, it might be a little hard to follow. I was just thoroughly loving it, though. It's a disjointed nature. This is the drum work here. This is, I think, where he really gets to shine. Not that he didn't in the previous two tracks, but I think there's more
Well, yeah,
of the drum
in the introduction to this track, there are moments where the keyboard's going and the drums are going off beat and kind of being a bit disjointed, but it's punctuating still what the piano's playing. In fact, this is the song where you had trouble finding the rhythm, no?
That could have been a later track, because
No,
it does
this-
get worse
this-
as it goes on.
This one I saw you for a good 2 solid minutes trying to count out the beat. You didn't know if it was a 6 or a 12. Might have been a 24.
I doubt that, but this is... No,
Might have been.
I don't know, this track seemed pretty organized to me, all things considered. The disjointed nature is within a short framework. I think you can... Well, framework is going to get so repeated today.
Yeah.
But it's within a short bracket. It doesn't
Now-
last too long. It finds its place.
Yeah.
Now this song is something I had issues with aspects of it that I really did not have with the previous 2 tracks. There is a part that really punctuates my issue, which is part that really kind of changes the theme dramatically. Now, that's a major aspect of this song, is that it seems to be exposing different theme works to us. Different pieces of the same sort of basic idea, yet restated in dramatically different ways, which is one of the reasons why we seem to be getting a lot of chaos in the interaction of the multiple instruments. And each of these different themes that are being shown to us, or different ideas, is going to be restated using different instruments. And there's a part about 8 minutes into it, which sounds like a long time, but not really long for this track, that I just lose a major part of what I was flowing.
Well,
And I don't regain it after that to the same extent.
all right, I'll agree there. But in the same point, I don't want to get ahead of myself, because there's been enough material in that 8 minutes that I thoroughly love, and I want to dive into that now. Take a really long time to dive into things with these tracks. But after we get that opening theme work, which I said is kind of disjointed, but it's spacious, we get all that lasts a little while. And then we go into this sort of E minor, majestic, eerie segment that I guess it seems to be the returning theme. I think it defines the returning theme for this track.
That's the part with the horns?
If I'm not. It's difficult to describe it.
It's
to be
before
honest.
that major simplification with the piano. It was right before that. Which
This
was
is
the
when
horns.
the bass comes in and starts bending beneath everything else.
That was with the horns.
It starts waning with everything. Yeah, I think it was with the horn. I was loving that. And then it starts getting anxious as it goes further. Like, we get this trippy climax. You actually said it was like, how did you refer to it? It was complimenting? Was that the word you used to describe it?
No, complicating.
Complicating. That
yes.
was it.
That was the word. It's it's almost
This is after
this is
the eerie and majestic section, so these two back to back.
the bass and
favorite
piano.
moments.
The bass and piano were trying to establish something, and it was being established, but the additional instruments were just kind of like poking the arm that was painting in this case. They were changing it up enough that they were well staying within the lines, yet every once in a while it zigs outside, and it was just really unique and beautiful.
This
in that
climax was actually the way that it zipped outside, and I can, again, just to put a dose of theory in here, it was because of the chord that they used. We're coming from E minor, and then we go into this F sharp sus7 chord. So it's like we move up one chord from the 1 chord to the 2 chord, but it's suspension. It's a suspended 7th. Again, like in the first track here, like in Galaxy 32, we don't get the major or minor inclination. We're away from both. It's like we're off in space. It feels futuristic and technical, and that when it reaches that climax, again, it's up there in my favorite moments of this album, which so far are building. There are many, and we haven't even scratched the surface of what's actually to come later here. But yeah, I think that defines the climax of this piece. We do have problems later, though. First of all, we don't get a grand restatement of the main theme. We get kind of this alternate, peppier restatement of the main theme. It's not really grand, it's just kind of, again, we're almost back to Sawblade material here. But we do get a striking duality of the trading solos. Yes, at times it can get exhausting, but it can also be kind of brilliant because it brings that battle element back. The hunt.
It was, but...
I'm talking pre-8-9 minute mark.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because once it gets past the 8-9 minute mark,
yeah.
Then
it gets a little meandery. Yeah. It just gets... There you go. It gets a little meandery, and you start to get lost. It's not as solid and cohesive as the rest of it.
It's a shame, almost, because I think that up until then, we broke the saw blade.
Yeah.
We had that F-sharp sus7 chord, as I said, and then it exceeds that in the second climax with an E11th chord. 11th chord, just a little more theory. We start to get into what's called the upper partials. I've actually explained this a couple times before, maybe back into Godstick's podcast. We get into, like, things above 7th. 7th is within, but then when you're working off 9ths, 11ths, 13ths, you're working into a chord that, if played openly on a piano, it would expand almost 2 octaves, which is pretty far. So, when you play it condensed, and you can rearrange those notes to play it in a more condensed fashion, there's just this... You can't go much farther than a 13th in terms of chordal complexity. That's why when I hear this, it's not just that it sounds complex, it brings so many emotions to mind, like longing. I hear that in the secondary climax. It's a shame that it gets static after that. Yeah. But I love the first half of this track.
The second half, meandering... Storm, that was the perfect word.
It's just one of those things where, you're so I mean, the first 2 tracks, pretty much, even with minor complaints in the first 2 tracks, if any, you're invested pretty much from beginning to end.
I want to adjust the minute mark, though. I think it was more like a minute 13, because we're forgetting about one major thing that we do get that follows all that other stuff.
Yeah.
It was the exploration of drum work texture. It almost sounded like stomp. That's what we get at the 9-minute mark, which actually is new material, and I would defend that. Again, some people might think it sounds even more disjointed. I personally loved it.
It was okay, but still, the track on a whole, after that 8-minute mark, wasn't... This track
after the 13-minute mark.
13-minute mark. This track just doesn't stay as cohesive, solid, and engaging as the last 2.
It rambles. It's trying a little bit too much to keep saying the same thing.
I think it was this...
There was the restatements. It was once again restating, and... To be honest, there was
I guess there was
6
only
or 7 restated?
1 or 2 things here that got jarring because they were restated so much, and that was right after that, what I just referred to as the stomp bit, when the drum goes all out and they're playing disjointed. Right after that, you have this sort of menacing, cyclic repetition where the keyboard joins with... It's like... And then it builds again. But at the same time he does that so many times, I don't know. It's a little bit grating.
It got grating and repetitive by that point. It wasn't so egregious that it was a huge problem, but it definitely just wasn't as engaging as what had come before it.
I think it's because of the way it was phrased. It was phrased in such a manner that seemed to be their intention of a climax. Yeah. That seemed to be what we all wanted to focus toward, what the band themselves wanted us to build to, when I was more invested in the previous climaxes in the piece.
And it's one of those things that they could have just been messing around, and they were...
That's jazz, though.
Yeah, they were playing with it, and they thought they were going to find something, and maybe they didn't.
And the outro just takes too long.
Well, this is the outro that I'm talking about, essentially. The last several minutes of the piece seem like an outro.
One long outro that kind of drones towards the end, almost.
It's a weird word to say when you're talking about, so many lines of melody, of solo melody.
When you're talking about something that people spend their lives studying so that they can do.
Yeah.
And yet...
It's ironic.
Yeah.
But, again, you can have... Complex ideas don't always mean great ideas.
True.
Yeah.
All right. Wow, it's the longest I think we've ever taken to talk about 3 tracks. Moving on to 4, though.
Royalty.
Royalty. So this track, immediately, when I first heard this track...
I forgot about something.
Okay.
In Portals to Forever.
We didn't mention the lounge section, which was also a huge section of this piece.
Dude, do you know how many sections of this piece we haven't mentioned?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily help my case because it too has nothing to do with the theme.
Yeah.
But it was a very, just to go over it, it was a very contented, I guess the almost jazz that people think of stereotypically if you're watching PBS and you're watching
it was a little refreshing.
It was refreshing.
But more as an interlude.
Yeah, it wasn't really enough.
Yeah, I guess it was the section after that kind of dragged. All right. I guess we'll put this song to sleep.
Royalty. Once again, we're getting the trio, my favorite 3 pieces, in a sultry, to some extent, intro. Once again, exploring that very much sensual theme that was present in Planet Chia.
I was on the verge of calling this like a Gershwinian theme.
What the heck does that mean?
George Gershwin.
Yeah,
I got little
Gershwinian?
elements of just little speckles of chord work here and there, which brought me back to like the 20s and 30s. It was interesting.
It had that to me, the first thing I said when I heard this was, I wrote down better for dancing. Because in my head, that's all I pictured was a ballroom and people kind of dancing and stepping to this and middle-aged people on a cruise ship, going for a dance night.
Well,
yeah, that's why I felt the need to go back to the PBS jazz section in the previous track because I almost enjoyed that better than I did this.
Yeah. You're seeing movement. That's what it really boils down to.
Yes,
just movement.
But beginning with this track, and I'm kind of putting an overarch on it, which we're going to get into more detail. I felt this one also was a bit rambly, like the last track.
It was rambly, but then again, I want to, there's going to be so much devil's advocacy going on here because yes, it was more rambly, and yes, I probably enjoyed the previous track better in terms of the different sections it explored.
Right.
This song doesn't explore as many sections. At the same time, it emphasizes a completely different thing. The entire track is a journey. It's a search. It's looking for something, and I almost enjoyed that on a whole nother level, if not for the most immediate.
Yet, one of the big lacking features I found was the lack of a hook.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
That's the reason it is the way I'm describing it.
Yeah, that's why
there's no hook.
There
It's
can
searching
be a
for the hook.
hook in a journey, and it's that lack of culmination that detracts from the song for me.
I mean, I will agree with John.
But
It didn't really have a climax.
It's true, but at the same time, artistically speaking, I believe that was the point here.
Well,
Again,
I can accept that. I can accept it. I would have preferred
It becomes a taste
little
issue
more.
at
Yeah,
that point.
I really
think
will
is what it
admit that.
really is.
Let's put it this way. It at least gives it the track more cohesion in the fact that there's a consistency of searching for that hook than the previous track did in its exploration of so many disparate
Yes, I will agree with
themes.
that. This was definitely a much more cohesive track in its overarching theme.
There are no disparate themes
No.
here. There's no theme.
Yet at the
Right.
time,
In a way.
the previous work here that's been going on, there's been a real, not heart pulse, but pulse to it. Almost metronomic type of breathe in, breathe out aspect to the songs. And I got that on a very macro piece that there is breathe in and then a minute later breathe out. But in the micro scale of the moment to moment, it was very chaotic.
It could be chaotic, yet at the same time I felt a little bit mellowed when all was said and done. Because when you take the track as a whole, you almost get this effect, this ambient effect. Like it is just a drone that you are supposed to kind of zone out to, or feel very relaxed in witnessing what he's searching for.
Well, that's why
You probably had a couple drinks at your bar, you know?
Well, that's why I said it was better for dancing, because sitting and listening to it, it almost felt ambient. It was like just almost ambient to me, because it was not necessarily slower completely, but it was definitely a lower tone. It was definitely this a more relaxed feeling than any of the other tracks had given.
Well, John did start out by saying he prefers slower jazz, and there was a smoother nature to this.
Yes.
It's really strange. You know, you're walking the fine line here. The last track was chaotic in terms of the theme work it was putting out there, and this track is chaotic only in the meandering nature of it.
Yeah.
It's a very strange thing, which made me assume that though you might, on the face of it, call this a smooth jazz track, it has a touch of avant to it.
Like, it's not just a smooth jazz track. It has too much to it for that, I feel. To just be a basic smooth jazz track.
Exactly.
It still had more layers.
I call it avant not because it's like atonal or dissonant, not in the same way that certain other jazz artists will go out and avant-garde. This is just avant because it explores with having no theme.
Yeah.
It's just a giant... I forget exactly how long this track was, but I think it was another long one. It's a giant search.
It was a really good scotch.
Ooh.
It went down. It burned. It did create turmoil when it first goes down on each sip. Yet it mellows. It relaxes, and it gives you... It brings you to a different place. And you keep taking little sips of that chaos throughout the song, and it works. It's really weird how relaxing this, once again, tete-a-tete is working.
It's almost like an exploration of the way the mind works itself. Like how the mind can kind of meander and search around for things, but yet you'll have these little crisscross neurons that will remind you of something. You'll have nostalgia, and that appears because there's one thing that seems almost so out of place, but it's blended in so smoothly. There's a callback to a very old John Coltrane song here. These are a few of my favorite things.
Yeah.
You hear it in the piano work.
You don't hear it right away because it has been the tempo has been
it's your classic.
It's distorted.
It's your classic
in its tempo.
Use of music borrowing. It's an homage to the past, and I kind of loved it. After in the beginning, I was a little it confused me, but in the end,
honestly, also because I would love it more if it was unintentional. Because it could be. He could have just been playing with things he knows, and he could be a fan of that, and then brought it in by accident, and then continued to play with it once he realized
stumbled upon it.
I would challenge, though, and say, nay, this was no accident.
It could have been a subconscious thing from its initial conception, and then became.
I just thought it was a funny point, considering that I started by giving the introduction to this guy as the generation that followed John Coltrane, and what do I get? It was a coincidence.
I will point out one thing: hearing that aspect when you pointed it out, hearing that aspect unified the track in a much more. It became much more palpable.
Yes.
Once I heard that.
Yeah. And it was one of those moments where once you hear a thing in a song, you can't unhear it.
I can unhear it until I get to that point, and then I hear it again, and everything, like my past changes with that aspect.
Right. Now, I think as we go on here, I don't want to be unfair, but I believe there's one track that we're going to gloss over a bit, and that is Outside of Space, track 5.
So this is track 5, yeah. This is the only one that could be referred to probably as a song instead of a piece. It had vocal work.
It was only 5 minutes.
And for me, it was just so out of place. Like, I know there's jazz with vocalization, and the vocalist in this track that was featured, her name is Gail Morin Corea. So I imagine the wife of Chick Corea.
Yeah, there you are.
If I had to guess.
So, yeah, let's just put it out there. It does seem almost like a bit of a courtesy, of course.
It just feels like I don't even want to go to that level. I just feel like this track is a cop-out for the album. Just because it doesn't match up with anything else on the record. It doesn't fit the themes of the rest of the record.
Posing a possible explanation.
Right. Now, and the singing wasn't bad. It felt so out of place.
Well, here's my thing. General overarching statement.
Yeah.
Jazz vocalists can really... Let's put it this way. I love scat. I'm a very big fan of scat. I think that's actually it's amazing to hear a jazz vocalist, do what other instruments do.
Yeah.
And doing their own solos, essentially, just off the cuff. Don't worry about lyrics, don't worry about anything else, just go with the music and do what you feel is right.
It's kind of like an early form of beatboxing, scatting.
Yeah, in many ways. So that's like one side. The other side is to go the same way that all singers have gone for ages past, and that is to sing a song, a melody. It's a set melody. There's really no improvisation there, and you're trying to reach certain climaxes, make certain claims, perhaps in your lyrics. And that's what the song does. I can't say it does much more, though. In many, not that I'm disparaging other tracks that we talk about, because most of the stuff we talk about has lyrics, when we're not talking about jazz. When we're talking about all the other albums that we've reviewed, we're looking at that. But it doesn't seem to be... It seems like the instruments that are used in those cases are built so closely around lyrics, and it feels like here, it could have you could have taken her out, and the music would still be there, and you'd still be able to focus on it.
And that's actually what they do. After the initial vocal expose, they replace her with the clarinet, and then they replace her with other instruments, and it's really just restating the way her vocals were interacting with the original music. And I'm not a big fan of her original vocals. I mean, I think it's unimpressive.
It's part of the art. That's, again, it's very common for jazz vocalists.
There was no melody to support her, and she wasn't supporting the way the instruments were playing.
It's like revisiting the culture of standards that we had back in the 50s. You had all these jazz standards around that people have been following for years and years and years, and it seems like this is an attempt to reintroduce new ones. In my heart, I don't feel like this is going to stick.
And it just didn't have the same heart and soul that the rest of the record had. It was missing something.
There's definitely there's a soul that it's trying to every single time she tries to reach a high note. There's this John doesn't like this. I kind of like, or at least I understand it. When she reaches something that is just short of the high note, it's
a high octave.
It ends up dissonant.
Yeah.
Even though she's playing very highly, it's a curious thing, but it's done a lot as far as I've experienced in jazz concerts.
The solos weren't solos. That's my big thing. They were not unique in their aspects. I mean, yes, they are differences between the various solo work on the various instruments, but they're very samey. Let's stick with which unique. Is weird.
Let's stick with the not unique term, because I think that's really going to sum up my feelings on this track. It's a shame to do that so early in all of this, because this is our first jazz album, but I already have to say that me being the most experienced with jazz here, I've heard a lot of this. I've heard a lot of this, not so much with the rest of the stuff in this album, but I've heard a lot of this track, Outside of Space. It's just, it's out there. You said it's on every cruise ship.
Yeah.
It's in every...
I don't want to hear this on this album. Hall, After getting 1 through 4, even though I had issues with certain tracks on 1 through 4, I still overall liked all of it. Whereas this, it just took me out of it. I was immediately knocked out of the immersion that the rest of the album had set up.
Right.
And so I think more or less we've talked circles around this song. But the reality of it, it's not a great track. It's not awful by any means of any imagination. But
it's on the same principle that we tend to judge a lot of pop tracks.
Yeah.
They introduce something, they introduce it solidly. There's no problems with it inherently. It just
doesn't fit for the record.
Doesn't fit for the record, not original, not introducing new material, that vein.
Yes.
Now,
moving on to track 6, Pledge for Peace.
This is Royalty's concept of the Scotch highball concept done to the next level.
It takes this album to another place that, it's another moment to moment thing, but there are moments in this song that hit such high notes. This is where the saw blade definitely flies off the track.
I'll be the first to say I think this should have been the final track in the album.
I agree.
Now, it begins with
This should have been a 6-track album.
It begins with a great frantic piano work that leads into a fluid yet chaotic composition. It transitions.
We got a lot of tension in the beginning.
Yes.
It's very texture heavy. You're exploring a lot of... First of all, this is where the drum gets to almost reduce the tightness that it's had so far. It gets to play very loosely, and I love this style of drum work. I'm not ashamed to say that. When you're not sticking within a particular rhythm per se, the drum is used purely as accent and texture. Mm-hmm. You roll on the tom toms for a while. You roll on the snare. You use a brush on the crash cymbal. Yeah. Really, it provides these accents that they're only done in, I guess, what you now think of as jazz noir.
There are other bands that utilize stuff like that, even if it's not jazz. I mean, one of my favorite things...
But not to this extent, in my opinion.
No, of course. Let me finish my sentence.
Nope.
I was just trying to say something that...
we need a minute to laugh.
It's kind of unrelated to jazz specifically, but I like bands that have multiple percussions. Like Guster is a band that has both drums and bongos. And stand-up bongos and other percussions like that are... They accent what the percussion is keeping beat with. The percussion is the standard beat that you expect from a drum line in a song, and then the bongos get to accent the song. And you get a sense of that kind of accent just from the drums themselves in this track.
Well, I guess the thing that I'm talking about is more the search of setting. It's like, when these drums are being used in such a way, and you consider the rolling piano, the fact that there's really no theme being stated at all here, it's all these sounds. You just get this soundscape. It's a setting. It's a scene. It's like a dark alley. Like, that's what I get from this intro, and I love tracks that are that evocative.
The drums are water being poured on sidewalk.
Yeah.
They pull where they may. There is something there, but after just a few moments, it gets distorted, discolored.
There's fear there also.
There's a unity about it, yet in certain areas it's drier, in certain areas it's wetter. It pools here, drips off there. It's got the true fluid nature of water that's just great. Yet
there's a quiver.
Yet there is the piano. The piano creates...
The piano is a quiver, and yet also the soprano sax.
There's chaos. There's something just poking through that's breaking that smooth tension that really is just creating a discord and a startling feeling that's just awesome.
Just to walk through, one of those instances, I think, is the soprano sax. It comes in literally for like 2 seconds just to go...
Yeah.
Crescendo, decrescendo. Builds up, builds down. And it just comes... It's this is something that you could build a horror movie around this. Probably a good one, too.
There's so many genres that would kill to use this type of song.
Yeah.
To base something on.
And it does ebb and flow. I do like your comparison to water. It does feel like a wave nature to the whole opening of this track.
And it finally does settle after four-ish, 5-ish minutes.
Yeah, a little while.
It finally settles down on a true jazz club salon style of flow.
Yeah, we go back to that PBS jazz, which I'm not bashing. I like PBS jazz.
I kind of needed it. There was just so much back and forth and transitioning,
right?
And the flow, the startle back and forth, the settling calmed everything down, which allowed me to transition to one of the most beautiful things I've heard in my life.
So this is my favorite moment on the album, hands down. I'm still in the wings of whether this is my favorite track. It's definitely up there. But this stand-up bass solo is one of the... First of all, so how it starts is, when the stand-up bass solo begins, all of the instruments cut out. All that you hear is this stand-up bass, and it builds, and it plays.
This is a legitimate, true, just one-instrument solo. And before it even gets into it, there's clapping. That's the other aspect of this song. It has a very personal feel to it, because there is
You get the impression of it
There's
being live. Whether there were people in the studio, whether it was actually live, or
if it's just musicians applauding each other. I mean, this is a huge band anyway. I mean, there's a bunch of people playing.
But yeah, it does add a personal element here, because, again, I have no issue with them breaking the fourth wall in that regard, because otherwise, if you weren't, then you'd have things that were probably written a lot more tightly than this was. By tightly, I, of course, mean, themes that run together, fluid composition and everything. We're talking about solos here. Everything about jazz is very personalized. Every single time you give your head nod to the other instrumental and say, all right, take it. That's personal.
But also this is personal because you feel like you're a member of the band in the studio with them. You get that vibe where you're pulled in, so immersed.
There's a lot of anticipation.
And I think that's why we went from that anxious introduction into this sort of fun, refined section that's not as gritty as what we were introduced for. That's what we built. That's what brings it back to that personal element, and that's what allowed you to release yourself and hand it to the bass.
And it's
like the whole audience is handing it to them.
This bass solo is, first of all, one of the best solos I've ever heard. One of the best bass solos I've ever heard. And then, foremost, definitely one of the best stand-up bass solos I've ever heard.
Let's just look at some cold, hard facts about the upright bass. It's a big instrument. It's a big, clunky instrument. You need to, just to go one half step, you need to have your fingers pretty far apart from each other. Having played the violin when I was younger, the transition from a violin to an upright bass is just insane. It's a difficult instrument to play. To wrap your fingers around that entire fretboard, and to do it in a way that the volume is actually pleasurable to the audience. It's a difficult thing to do live, which also makes me give a head nod to the engineer here, because there was a lot of dynamics in this bass solo. That's the most impressive thing. He gets soft.
The engineer, whose name is Bernie Kirsch, who did all the engineering on this record.
Oh, good job, Bernie.
Yeah. He did... And I mean, it's so apparent on this moment.
Maybe they spent a weekend at Bernie's.
My favorite thing about this solo, though, is that the instruments dropped out. It's one of those things where the spotlight's on this performer,
right,
and he does not disappoint. And he builds to this release that was incredible.
It's dynamics that I think is my favorite part about it.
The solo starts with the classic trio of this album working in tandem, and it's almost like, to put it very much white collar, blue collared, it's like the bassist went, all right, guys, all right. You're done? I got something to say. So just hold on a minute. And he goes into something that is just, it's simple. It really is simple.
I disagree.
In what it sounds like, but it creates such a buildup of emotional pressure that after a while I'm actually hoping it ends, because I need to release what he's building. He needs to end.
I see what you're getting at. I see what you're getting at. I just don't see where you get the word simple here. I think even apart from this just being a difficult instrument to solo on, I think it was a magnificent solo in terms of the way it was phrased with the rest of the piece.
Complicated in its phrasing.
Also, just another
simple.
minor note.
Okay, simple is wrong. Pure is probably a more appropriate. It's so much one thing that it's got a purity to it that it's so hard to rival.
Well, just on a technical note, I've also never heard an upright bass solo, and maybe this is just to my fault, having never gone and sought out a lot of upright bass solos, but I've never heard one that actually made use of so many double stops in a row. That's when you play two strings at once, right? And he plucks it both at once, because usually you can't... It's hard to find your way around that fretboard and end up on a place where you can firmly say, all right, my fingers are just far apart from each other to get those two notes at once, because obviously if they were any further you wouldn't be able to do it, and phrase it within context of the entire line of melody. It's just too impressive to me. Hands down to the muscular strength of all these guys.
Well, also John said something that makes a lot of sense. Upright bass is one of the only instruments where it doesn't matter if you want to play it, if you're short, skinny, and weak, it's not the instrument for you.
If you got small hands, you're never gonna play it.
It's just you have to have the power to play that instrument.
Yeah.
Whereas a guitar, just about anyone who can hold a guitar can learn to play a guitar if they have the coordination. This requires so much strength as well.
You have to be physically able.
They might
instrument.
actually sell a little bit smaller sized ones that.
It's possible.
Smaller-handed person might be able to wrap it. But then again, you probably are sacrificing other things, such as the depth of sound that the full-sized upright bass can offer you. And that's what brings me back to dynamics here. There's so much... It starts out so strong, and then he purposefully has a decrescendo where he just dies down and gets so soft. Again, engineer really has the mic right up against the fretboard here in order to pick up those tones, and everything is just crisp
so crisp. And it was so perfect that they dropped out all the instruments. It just made it that much crisper and brought this attention to this instrument that doesn't always get that kind of an attention.
Chills down our spine. I felt like I was in a tundra.
Oh, it was incredible.
I had my back was tensing. I was anticipating the release of this solo so much that It was a physical feeling.
It was almost masturbatory. It really was.
It was
close. Almost masturbatory.
It was very close.
Because it was just this kind of build-up and this welling. It just really was.
And then it stops.
And not even in like a gross, grody way. Like it really just
Well, it also it's
way.
also because of the nature of the bassist, and this is any bassist, electric or upright. They tend to be such, they're in the background. This is a stereotype that goes to bassists, but yet they're always so cool. They play it so cool. And this is as if to say, wait, the album isn't over yet. The bassist hasn't spoken yet.
Yeah, exactly.
And everyone shuts up for that.
And the crowning part of this whole thing is he stops. Everybody cheers. I cheered. First time I heard it, I was driving. I started clapping. I immediately grabbed the wheel again. It was just one of those moments where I was just so happy to have experienced this.
Yeah, you got it.
It was amazing. It was just pure amazement.
Can't say it better. That said, I think everyone agrees, and everyone would agree on this album, that this is the climactic point of the entire album.
Yes, this is where it hits its highest point.
It might depart from certain things, like the spacey theme, but at the same point, it's just everything's phrased in such a way that this bass really, really takes the cake.
Oh, yeah.
That said, this is not the end of this track.
No.
And that hurts
That was like the halfway mark.
That hurts it. Even if they had like a minute or 2 minute outro, I would have been fine with it. I would have been like, all right, yeah, everybody, band, get back together, have your drinks afterwards. It's that's the way I interpret, the outros after a solo like that. But it wasn't. It was almost half the track. Half the track was spent on an outro. And that's a big critique of mine. To be honest, I felt like it was... We termed it as overwhelming, but it's not just a matter of overwhelming. It's literally dragging at that point.
Yeah.
It's dragging out the inevitable because you know that there's not going to be a climax, and they don't. They really don't hit a climax that is anywhere near that bassist's.
Well, it's also along the lines of that idea of it being masturbatory. Once you have that release, it's just uncomfortable after that. I'm serious. It's like once you have that kind of a release, it's like you're done.
It's like the rest of this track is you just sitting in the chair going, ugh.
It took me a solid minute and a half of listening to the outro to really start listening to the outro. I was coming down from the high.
Yeah.
And
who would make half a porn video the aftermath?
Right, exactly.
Now, it's not all bad. It isn't all bad. It's
very not bad at all.
It's like, at this point, I kind of have to gloss over. It's like, yes, these are great musicians. These are probably the best musicians we've ever reviewed, blah, 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 blah. We get it.
Yeah.
But I can't... There's still no theme presented later on here. We
Until
don't return...
the actual outro, which was...
which is legitimately the last minute.
Yeah.
And it is, once again, the trio. And I don't know what's going on, but that itself finished the song for me and brought me back to earth.
This is what I call a Beethoven ending. Now,
yeah, you had mentioned that when we were listening.
I think that's an easier term to understand than Gershwinian.
Probably.
I think a lot more people say Beethoven, first of all. Because
I saw the movie.
When you compare things to Beethoven, people should know it.
We got it. Thanks, John.
Yes,
you can actually sing that on the podcast. That's
actually, wasn't that Mozart?
It's not. But
it's a movie called Mozart. The big movie that really does explore who Beethoven is.
It's called Amadeus.
Thank you.
That doesn't explore Beethoven.
But
I thought that was the one that did Beethoven.
No, it's Amadeus Mozart.
No, but from Beethoven's point of view?
No, it's from Scarlatti's.
Thank you.
I think Scarlatti.
Thank you.
Anyway, the point...
I might have that name wrong.
I saw it when I was
back
13.
on track.
Okay.
This song, in a nutshell, is good, but there's a great moment that makes the rest of the song, except for the actual outro itself, a little disappointing.
Well, as I was starting to say, by comparing it to what I call a Beethoven outro, there's this little thing. If you listen to some of Beethoven's symphonies, they have very, very long outros because it feels like the composer himself does not want it to end. He's too wrapped up in the theme. He's like, "Oh, this is awesome! This is awesome! This is awesome!" Not that I'm dissing Beethoven. Who would diss Beethoven? But seriously, there are moments where you're sitting through it and you're like, "Wow, where is this ending?"
Where is it going?
If it's impressive, but at the same time, where is it going? Beethoven was still able to state it, of course, in ways that were, related to the theme. But when people say Beethoven outros, they're typically referring to ways in which they've forgotten what the theme. They're just going on and on and on and on and on and on and on because they're too wrapped up in it. I personally think that we were a little bit too harsh, and this is what I was trying to defend Portals of Forever, because Portals of Forever, to be honest, spent a good course of the last half going through different themes, to the point where I didn't feel like it was rambly necessarily. Yes, there were certain moments here and there, but I can't call it as bad as this. And it's like, maybe we're being defensive of Pledge for Peace just because we love the bass solo so much, but I can't defend the track in a whole. I still think that Portals to Forever was, I think, a more solid track.
But I never said that, personally for me anyway, that Portals Forever, because it got meandery, that it made it a poor track.
Yeah, but we spent a lot of time,
To be fair, you guys spent a lot of time.
Yeah, he was quiet during that
track.
one.
I didn't
Alright.
have a lot more to say because...
Breaking the fourth wall, I'll stop looking at you, I'll look at John.
Well, no, it's just also, for me, for that
With a wagging
track...
finger.
That track, I acknowledged that it was a little meandery, but that said, it was still a solid track that I enjoyed. It was just the fact that we all agreed it did get a little meandery. This track...
And also, the other thing about Pledge for Peace, it's not just rambly. There's a word to describe it which was ill-chosen when I previously mentioned it in Royalty, and that is the word avant-garde. It's more apt here.
Yeah.
This is rambly to the when most people think of rambly, they think of avant. When most people think of avant-garde, they think rambly.
Yes.
They're
It's long-winded.
Long-winded.
Outro. It just doesn't know when to stop.
Well, it's along the lines of what Steve's saying. It's Beethoven in its sense that it doesn't know where it's going or how it's going to end.
That's the whole thing. Rambling kind of gives an idea that it's jumping from place to place. This was a lot more repetitive than that.
The more and more, I mean, I know this is really like beating a dead horse here, but
No.
I do feel like it's important to put this in perspective, and now I'm almost taking it back. Beethoven ending is really more of a positive statement, and I think I'm going to attribute that to Portals of Forever, rather. I think that was a Beethoven ending, whereas it reaches climax, and all these other different statements of the theme. It's wrapping up. You are aware that it's wrapping up, but it's wrapping up for so long. Still, it's epic in its conclusion.
The final note is repeated
in this
18
case,
times.
there's no word to describe it, and I shouldn't be describing it in Pledge for Peace. It's just, there is no further point after the bass solo. There's nothing.
The song could have ended
it's the time for the musicians to just show off. And I think I want to leave it at that. Because there are definitely people out there who would be absorbed in this. I don't want to exclude them. That's just the nature of jazz in many cases.
Yes.
And on to the final track, Legacy. There's a reason why we wanted the album to end on the bass. And not just because of the second half of Pledge. Legacy was a summation of the whole album without any expansion.
But the problem is with Legacy from the get-go is that it brings back themes that were stated earlier in the album in a bit of a different way, but not different enough to be engaging. We all agreed that at this point in the record, especially halfway through this song, we were bored. We were getting bored at least, because it was nothing.
It may also be the tone that we're left on because of the end of Pledge for Peace.
Yeah, where it was one of those things
in many
that
ways
came
it felt like
crashing
a
to the ground.
continuation of the rambling. But no, I don't want to go that far. The song wasn't rambly per se. It's just it is a summation. It actually echoes the beginning of Pledge for Peace in terms of that texture heavy. Whatchamacallit?
It feels spacey again.
At points, it echoes every song.
It echoes that stuttering piano which I loved in the first track.
But it feels like it's.
I loved it in the first track because of the way it was stated and everything else. Here it's thrown in.
This track was, as I had said when we were listening, it's kind of almost devoid of heart and soul. It just doesn't have the same kind of heart and soul and feeling the other tracks that it's restating had.
We're nearing our wrap up here, so I'm just trying to be fair about everything.
Yeah, and we ran.
And there's a lot of. We're splitting hairs in many places, but we're splitting them for good reasons, but also sometimes shallow reasons. It goes like this. I spent a huge amount of time just, criticizing the end of Pledge for Peace, yet at the same time, I almost feel like that would have been alleviated had Legacy been completely absent.
Yeah.
Then I almost would have expected that jazz, jam, avant-garde ramble. Because, let's put it this way, even though that was like 8 minutes in of itself, the very last minute of Pledge for Peace was a very cool outro. It was very satisfying.
Yeah.
But Legacy doesn't do that. Legacy is much more stagnant in the way that it revisits every single theme, and it ends on a dime.
Yeah.
Like, really quickly. Abrupt.
It just
Too abrupt for some of the
It's
the softer tones that were stated throughout the album. I feel like they didn't deserve that abruptness.
it's a summation, but it's an almost tangential summation. It jumps around and goes, "Hey, you remember this? Hey, you remember that?
You know
Hey,
what-
you remember this?" And it's just
You know what the problem is?
Here's my card. Here's my card.
No, you know what the problem is? Legacy is a very rock and roll structured track. It's a wrap up for a rock and roll record where it brings back themes of the album in a very structured sense, even though it's a longer track. But you don't want that on a jazz record. You want some kind of ridiculously epic creativity to take you off into the sunset, or a kind of cool, chill. Well, yeah, man, let's just relax and cool off.
Yeah, you don't-
and slow burn. You know,
You got an
don't
overture.
want. You don't want to be revisited by everything you already heard, because that's very standard and cliche. And the last thing you want
It's
on
an
jazz.
interesting way to put it.
I think
I'm
it's-
following you. At the same time, I don't personally feel that rock and roll records do that wrap up and revisit.
Okay, then
themes
then
necessarily.
let's
rock operas do that.
let's
rock
let-
operas.
Okay,
yeah.
so
Yeah.
let's
Oh,
put it
that's a
towards
different element.
let's put it towards more the musical aspect.
That's
And
another
most
animal.
musicals have a reprise and the ending where they kind of wrap everything up and bring back all the themes.
Yeah.
you don't need that in a jazz record. This-
I want something that blows my socks off, because I got them blown off a couple times already on this album.
it's
I
just-
wanted that.
That
That's
said-
how you. I want to be in anticipation of the next creation of this band. That's what I would want. That's what jazz feeds you: anticipation.
Yeah.
And instead, I got an overture. I got
an
a
overture at the ending.
summation.
That's why I said that we were almost doing this for shallow reasons, and
I
it's
got
not
footnotes.
going to hurt my rating that much, just a little bit, but it won't hurt it that much because let's put it this way: the simple fixes, I don't even think would be talking about this ad nauseum if it weren't for two simple things: either get rid of Legacy completely, right? Wow, that would have been such an easy fix, or have Legacy be track 1. Then it's actually an overture.
Then it's an overture.
Then you
yeah.
haven't heard this stuff yet, right? It's all new. It's all
Would have
fresh.
made more sense.
And then, whenever it came later on, and when it was stated, a little bit more firmly, a little bit more concisely, you would have been like, "Ooh, that's right. That's that thing we were told about in the introduction." But wow, it hit such a climax there, such as the stuttered piano,
Yeah.
in Galaxy 2.
The
Just
hunting.
imagine.
The hunting nature.
Yeah.
The trio.
Yeah. You would have been deprived of a smidgen of freshness, but you would have been released of the.
It would have been the appetizer for this meal.
Yeah.
It would have. You would have known exactly what to expect, yet be completely surprised. Now, we talked in very black and white terms. I want to say something. The worst parts of this album have complexity that I'm doing a wrap up. Matt's miming. I'm doing
I'm
a wrap
gesturing.
up.
Why did you have to bring up the gesturing? We were doing so well.
That's true, that was your
now,
fault.
no, because now I'm starting to come down and I'm really starting to get a little bit laid back because you don't have the high emotion of actually dissecting. The worst parts of this album are more complicated than things I've heard in years.
Yeah.
They are more astute than things I've heard in years.
True.
True,
They are worse than he's heard in years.
The
Save it for him.
simplest of instruments are better than our 3.5, 4-star rating type of things in rock and roll, in pop, in hip hop. I mean, they're mad geniuses throughout this album. You have a series of people who are off their meds creating the most artistic things I've heard in I don't know how long.
They're very experienced. We
Yeah.
haven't said that yet.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
he,
did.
He himself
We mentioned
is very
that. We
experienced.
mentioned that at
Yeah,
the beginning when we said
everybody-
he has over 50 albums. That's experience.
there's an infusion of
But
ideas
I wanted,
from so much
I wanted
area.
to drop implications. I just wanted to say it.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
Anyway, back to my wrap up.
Oh,
Yeah.
here we go.
There are issues, but the issues are. It's like saying, well, Galileo, not Galileo. What am I thinking?
Galileo.
Don't ask. Da Vinci did something wrong. That's what it's saying. Like,
Yeah,
that's
trying to
not,
say that this is bad is like saying Da Vinci was an idiot.
or that's not as good as his other work.
I have a brief anecdote, which will take no more than 30 seconds. There's a modern, well, he died in the 80s, but he used to play a lot of Baroque piano music. He was a performer by the name of Glenn Gould, who I think a lot of critics tend to really, really hate because of the fact that he used to make these grandiose claims about, art throughout the ages. At the same point, he was a very, very brilliant man. He may have even had a little touch in the head. He was so brilliant, like a savant in certain areas. But he would occasionally make these claims, like he'd be talking about Beethoven's later sonatas, and he would say, oh, well, yeah, that's when he could get away with anything he wanted. Back when Beethoven wrote that junk. He was quoted as saying this. And it was like, wow. I mean, okay, yes, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but at the same time, you should never, don't trample on the greats, necessarily, because without Beethoven, where would we be? So,
Right,
Yeah.
well, yeah.
That's like,
it's an anecdote to go with what John's saying. I
Yeah,
would never...
saying the
all
bad stuff
of the
here?
critiques that we're saying here are merely opinion.
And I have a minor anecdote. Like, it was always my big thing with my opinion on music that you can't... Only in very specific cases can you say something sucks. Otherwise, it's just your opinion. If you
Why
don't...
I hate that term.
Yeah, just because you
That's-
don't like it doesn't mean it sucks.
It's why I also hate the word junk. It's
Yeah.
based on that interview. I would never say that about something unless I absolutely detested it.
Right.
Critiques, as harsh as they may sound sometimes, these are really minor points. These are the ultimate musicophiles nitpicking. That's what it really comes
Yeah.
down to.
Yeah.
On the whole, what would you give it, John?
Parts of it are intimidating, which does
I
detract
can
a
see
little
that.
from it.
I can see that.
And parts of it, I scratch my head and go, yeah, that's beautiful, but I don't see how it fits. On the whole, it's just so well composed, so well designed. It's a 4-5. It really just... And it has a 6-star song on it, and a 6-star solo that's just magic.
I haven't heard that before.
No.
Interesting.
It's got... It breaks the mold at parts that are just so beautiful that words will never be able to describe.
All right. Well, having brought this album to the table and wanting to introduce us to jazz, period, I think I had a pretty good start.
You didn't introduce us to jazz. You beat
Yeah.
us in the face with it.
You know what I
You
mean.
wrote
Us,
jazz-
us
no, no,
as
no.
Crash
No, but
Chords,
what I'm-
having never done
What
it.
I'm trying to say is, please, I was trying to make a joke and you frickin' ruined it, and it drives me bonkers.
Can I make a joke?
I was just gonna say that you, instead of introducing us to jazz, you beat us to death in the face with it. Like,
wrote-
this is the best, probably the best jazz you could have possibly brought us, and you did.
Oh, that's what you were doing.
Yes.
It was
Did
funny.
I-
Everybody laughed. Yeah.
You wrote jazz on a baseball bat and hit me upside the head.
Pretty much.
Okay. Well, I'm proud of that much, at least.
You're welcome. I'm proud of you, too.
Here's the thing.
Here we go. Everybody strap in.
I mean, apart from the Crash Chords purposes, I haven't really thought about rating much jazz on a personal standard in any case either. Not that, not that every single time I'm listening to music I'm always thinking about what would I give it.
Right.
That's really only for this 2-hour period. But I haven't heard a wealth of Chick Corea's previous work, and I'm pretty impressed by this. I really am. Like, I didn't know what I was going to get necessarily. There's always the assumption that sometimes when you get the work from a man who was, upwards of 65 and in the upper, that you're going to get ideas that are rehashed or comfortable, really stuff that's, of the last 30, 40 years. Things that aren't necessarily fresh or groundbreaking, but always deliver. And that's what I was expecting here, of course. Because he hasn't released an album of original work in 10 years. But there's a good portion of work on this album that I do think is groundbreaking. Age, throw it out the window. I think that the first track itself is that brand of space jazz is unlike anything I've ever heard. Yes, it has elements of it, But that's the skillful master at play. He goes back and he borrows from little snippets here and there, such as later on in the album, he goes back to that John Coltrane song. He borrows from elements of, what do you call it? Lounge music, of course. That's predominant in any jazz club you might go into. He sometimes settles into that for a while, but he always brings you back to a new, groundbreaking idea. For this reason, I mean, I knew this track was going to be above 4, but the groundbreaking qualities, which is what I'm always looking for, it pushes it to the upper 4s for me. I probably would go as far as to say that this is a 4.6. The only reason it's not, really, really close to 5 is because of the moments in which he does settle. They do tend to run long at times because of the way the jazz is constructed. It's a general critique of jazz, or personal critique here, I should say, that they do sometimes lose sight of the theme despite the groundbreaking moments. Despite those groundbreaking moments, they come back, they're here, they're there, they're all over the place, but the cohesion sometimes gets lost. It's the art of jazz to explore, and this is a full exploration. But I'm a composition guy, so I almost wish that there was a sideline tangential album that took those moments and explored them to full fruition. Then I would be in the 5 territory. But 4.6 is pretty damn good. So, go Corea. Keep working.
You always have to pick those numbers that aren't quite in the middle points.
Oh, I always have my new reasons, because every album is
You like to
different.
be different.
He does.
I use quarters now, and honestly, over 4.5, you gotta use tenths.
No, I agree. Anything over a 3.5 or 4, you going into quarters makes sense, especially. And we make up the rules as we go along because it's our podcast. Anyway.
Everything's made up.
Points don't matter. It's like
We've been honest about this. 5 is very personal, and you have your very personal
specific
reasons to explain it. And it's just, there's a couple elements here that are a little bit lacking here and there. But 4.6 is, for all the general reasons in the pantheon of music, so high.
So for me, I mean, this was a very unique experience for me. I mean, especially considering we had done, a couple of instrumental records. We did Pacific Rim, which had its moments, but more or less was fairly mediocre. We had
Godsticks, which was just an assault of instruments.
And we had Tomorrow's Harvest, which was so technical, it was almost brain aching, at points. Whereas this, I mean, as much as there was a lot of great things going on and a lot of layers, it never felt like work. I enjoyed almost all of it.
It had a wholesome, exciting nature to it.
The only track that I can actively say I didn't like, and it's not because it was a bad track, but just because it ruined the immersion for me, was 5. Outside of Space, which, for me, someone who's functioning on an emotional level, immersion is very important to me. If you can draw me in where I'm not thinking, I'm just feeling, that's a big deal. And besides the end of, up until track 4, the immersion really hadn't been broken. And then track 5, I was just like, oh, this is really different for this record. I don't really like it.
Granted, the immersion was almost an hour at that point anyway.
Right.
I'm so proud of you guys. The one song on the record is the one that you're dissing. That makes me proud. I feel like I've achieved something.
But for as a whole, I mean, I really do like this record. I don't know that I'd go out of my way to listen to it all the time, but that doesn't mean it's a bad record. It just means I feel like this record would fit specific moments for me. But all in all, I really enjoyed it. I mean, I agree with John. That bass solo is a 6-star bass solo. It breaks the fucking record. Whoops, Steve's gonna have to bleep that. But for me, it's just one of those things. Is that I love that bass solo. It was so good.
Well, be careful. You can't rate based on a bass solo. Based on a bass. Based on a bass.
Bass, the 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 bass. I'm sorry, I was skipping. But I really liked the record, and I was surprised that I liked it as much as I did, because I don't listen to a lot of jazz. Like I said, my experience with jazz was more environmental than than personal. But there were a lot of personal moments on this record. Again, especially like Pledge for Peace.
Environmentally opposed to jazz. Interesting.
Well, not opposed to it. Just my experience with it was in an environment where jazz was being played. I never sought it out. But when I heard it in a ballroom scene or on a cruise ship or at a nightclub, I still really enjoyed it. Just I didn't focus on it as much as I had here.
You had a different framework to work upon.
Yes. So, for me, it's so tough. Like, I don't know. I guess I would say that it's definitely, for me, it's, I would definitely say it's beyond 4. It's definitely beyond 4. It's definitely beyond 4.
Is it beyond 4?
It's definitely beyond 4. I think I'm stuck in a loop.
I'm not editing this, just so you know.
Good.
Definitely 4.
Definitely about 4. Definitely. No, but it's not a 5. Steve's right. There's enough problems that aren't glaring issues that it wouldn't be a 5. But I think I don't want to give it a 4.5 either. It's just almost. It's a 4.4 for me. It's almost a 4.5. But to me, when I take a band that was a 4.5 or a 5, I loved every track, but maybe not every moment. But with this, there were moments that really took me out of the album. So, it's a 4.4 for me. And for my overall wrap-up, which I forgot to do last week, by the way, Jimmy Eat World, skip it. It's not worth listening to, buying, just skip it. Forget it.
This one, buy.
But this one, yes. This is on the range of skip it, listen to it, buy it, go out and get it. Go get this record. Because I feel it's really got something for everyone.
What was your number again?
4.4.
Okay.
4.4, 4.5, 4.6.
Interesting.
I just don't think it's 4.5. Because bands that I've rated that are 4.5, like Steam Powered Giraffe, like, there was just that other something. And I pretty much liked every track.
I got the other something. It's, complicated. Ratings are hard.
Right, but for this, it was just one of those things. I didn't get that something that I need to put it to that next level, but it by no means is bad.
It all depends on what we value, of course.
But again, in closing, for the overall wrap-up, buy this record. Please go buy it. It's a great record, and you'll enjoy it.
If you have any interest in jazz, come on, people, please.
I highly encourage it, even for those who aren't.
And because we went at such length, I'm gonna give a brief outline of a topic we're gonna be getting into. And I'm kind of curious. I want people to actually send us some questions if they feel the need to, because this is one I really want some feedback on. The idea is that instruments have the ability to go into all sorts of different genres. You know where drums are going to be when they're rock. You know where drums are going to be when they're folk. Certain instruments cannot be used the same way in certain genres, while some instruments can span genres and be used in all sorts of different ways.
Highly flexible.
And a good example is the piano. Piano can be in any type of music. It has been in every type of music. And it can be used in any type of way, every type of way, in those genres.
Just another reference to Beethoven. He once referred to the piano as the god of all instruments. And of course, you're not talking... He was from a time where we didn't have electric instruments, but we still had almost the same orchestral instruments as we do today, or highly similar. And it's accurate for the sake when you think you have 88 notes. Like, that's all you're going to need. You're not going to need anything below A0 or above C7. You're just not going to need them. You have everything at your disposal, and you have 10 fingers. You have access to it all. Every other instrument is constricted. So it's a very reasonable question that John poses, that instruments should find themselves in one particular brand of music or another.
An example of this is the violin. A violin in a more classical setting is used to state any sort of emotion, any sort of theme you can really think of because of the way it's being treated. Yet when you see it in a more modern-day rock and roll setting, it's hard to make it deviate from being a love sound or being a sad sound.
It's hard to state it as the instrument of youth, necessarily.
Yeah, it's
or of the youthful sound.
Yeah, and it's both a shame and it's interesting to explore how instruments are treated.
Yeah. But there's going to be some debate here, because there certainly are exceptions to the rule, and I think we're all going to come back with these exceptions when we look further into the topic.
And I really want to culminate this topic with your favorite specific instrument.
Indeed.
Ooh, that's tough. Yeah, I don't need time to think about
That's
Because
what I wanted to go
yeah.
to, because we're going to discuss all these instruments, and I want us to really, because I think once we really outline how we feel certain instruments are, it says a lot about what your favorite instrument is.
Yeah, that definitely would be for sure.
Indeed.
That would definitely be for sure. Never mind. Let's
Yeah,
just move on.
it's
Steve,
late.
let's get into our spam mail before I announce my pick for next week.
So for some brevity, here we go.
Brevity. Nagegerman Zekalitag Shigashisumons http://usillumiror.com. Is ye not Tortironri? http://gusangor.com. Eminkakure by Vinivievichitsrik.
That was a heady keyboard moment.
By heady, you mean the person who wrote that slammed their head into the keyboard?
I said
repeatedly.
heady.
That kind of heady?
keyboard. Yeah, that was
Not my wine is sweet and heady.
That's someone who has to stare at the keyboard
My
while they
lilac
type,
wine.
but someone messed up all the letters.
I've wanted to do that in my office. Take someone's keyboard and swap the letters around.
No, it's switching it off of QWERTY to that other system that nobody uses.
Right.
Yeah,
First one that existed.
yeah, the one nobody uses.
The pre-QWERTY.
Originally for next week, I had chosen something until I remembered halfway through this podcast there was an album I talked about. I had mentioned when we first selected Him that we were doing a metal record. I was wrong. I forgot. Him isn't really metal just because they call themselves love metal. However, I think it's time we do an actual metal band. And so I found out recently that in June, Black Sabbath, Ozzy included, put out a new record called 13. And so that's what we're going to do next week.
You sneaky little bastard.
Yeah,
I decided to bash you over the head with jazz, with a virtuoso, and now you're giving us the kings of metal. I see what you did there. I see. So now we're all just going to...
Ozzy did it?
Yeah, I believe Ozzy's in this record. Yeah.
You know,
awesome.
that means you have to do the same exact thing, John, in your following week. You need to come up with a band who are at the forefront of their genre.
Considering what he told me he wanted to do, actually, that album still kind of works.
Yeah. That's a secret, though.
But anyway, yes.
That time
I got a couple.
I started a cycle of her trend.
But yeah, I want to do Black Sabbath's new record 13 because I love Black Sabbath. I mean, classics like War Pigs. I mean, come on.
B, he loves metal.
Yeah, and B, I love metal, and there hasn't really been great metal records to come out lately that within the mainstream big name bands anyway.
And C, we're getting...
Actually, fun fact about Ozzy, when he was on the Osbournes and he acted like that, it was because he was on drugs and antidepressants. He's a lot more sharper than that. It's just...
A lot sharper, not more sharper.
He was sharper than that, but on that show, he was taking things that made him that kind of warbly.
That and he's actually cleaner than he was on the show.
Yes.
In fact, the best thing for that family was
because I
when they got
wanted
off
to
the
do
show.
metal, and I was going to first pick Megadeth, and then it got like a 30-something on Metacritic, and I was like, yeah, I wouldn't do that to my friends. I care about them too much.
It's Megadeth.
I would, yeah, thank you very much. I would
So.
challenge that there haven't, when you say there hasn't been great metal records released, it's another one of those
I
things.
amended it when I said
Okay,
it. I
all right.
said there haven't been great metal records by the big kings in a while.
Right, and even, I guess you could say metal in its purity.
Yes.
Because metal is another one of those genres which seems to have...
Fractured and split.
Exactly.
But no, I meant and quickly amended by the big giants. Metallica, Megadeth, Iron Maiden. I think Iron Maiden put out a record maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but Black Sabbath is like one of the bands. So
How old is Ozzy?
152,000 years old, if he's a day. Or something like that.
give or take 1,000 years.
We're going to say Aerosmith.
Give or take a day.
We're going to say Aerosmith ages. He's been around.
Anyway, on that note, and as always, music is life, and life is good.